What happens when a retired spy's carefully constructed anonymity gets shattered by alien brutality? I was just a ship mechanic on Ortsai 7 until Draven attacked my apprentice. That moment forced me back into the shadows I thought I'd left behind, armed with decades of intelligence training and a simple plan: make his death look like an accident. The Chrome Racer's engines cut through the station's ambient noise with a high-pitched whine, its azure energy shields casting shifting patterns across the mechanic bay's grimy walls. Draven Vorak emerged from the cockpit, his polished boots clicking on the metal deck plating as he tossed a set of ignition coils at the nearest workbench. "Realign the starboard thrusters," he commanded without looking at anyone, his voice carrying the bored arrogance of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Kira had been polishing her grandmother's crystal navigator in the corner, the delicate instrument catching the light with each careful rotation of her cloth. The heirloom's intricate internal lattices glowed faintly, a family treasure that had survived 3 generations of service on merchant vessels. Draven's attention snapped toward the glinting object, his reptilian eyes narrowing as he crossed the bay in 3 swift strides. "Human artifacts have no place near Vorak technology," he stated, his hand snatching the crystal from her grasp. When she instinctively reached for it, his backhand caught her across the face with enough force to send her crashing into a tool cabinet. The crystal shattered against the deck plating, its luminous fragments scattering like frozen starlight. The crack of her forearm breaking echoed in the sudden silence. From the shadows near the engine diagnostics terminal, the mechanic watched, his hydrospanner freezing midway through a calibration. 2 Vorak guards moved to block the exits, their armored boots grinding crystal shards into the floor. The mechanic's knuckles whitened around his tool as he measured the distance, the angles, the 23 years of calculated restraint holding him in place. He remembered the old maxim that had guided his operations. Revenge operates most effectively in cold vacuum, where heat signatures fade and evidence dissipates. Kira's grandmother had warned them just last week that pride would get them killed, that survival required swallowing insults like bitter medicine. Now her granddaughter's blood seeped into the cracks between deck plates, the lesson written in fractured bone. That night, in the cramped quarters behind the mechanic bay, he opened a panel hidden behind his bunk's coolant unit. The biometric lock recognized his fingerprints, the first time his hands had touched that particular scanner in over 2 decades. Inside lay not tools for repairing ships, but instruments for recalibrating realities. He mapped Draven's movements, his habits, his vulnerabilities with the methodical precision of someone remembering a native language. The old spy emerged from retirement not with dramatic pronouncements but with silent purpose. His wrench would still turn bolts tomorrow, but tonight his mind turned toward permanent corrections. The medical bay's antiseptic glow cast long shadows across Kira's pallid face as she lay perfectly still, her shallow breathing matching the rhythmic pulse of the bone knitter field surrounding her forearm. Pain suppressants had glazed her eyes with a milky film, but behind that chemical veil, her mind remained acutely aware of every sensation: the sharp ache where bone fragments had been realigned, the cool pressure of the med unit's restraints, the distant hum of the station's life support systems. All these inputs processed through a consciousness refusing sedation's embrace. The mechanic sat beside her med berth, his posture arranged in the careful slump of a weary mentor. His hands rested on his knees, calloused fingers tracing invisible patterns on his worn work pants. To any observer, he appeared exactly what he'd pretended to be for 23 years, a simple mechanic keeping vigil over his injured apprentice. But behind his calm exterior, his mind charted trajectories through Sector 9, calculating velocity vectors and gravitational variances with precision he'd forced himself to forget decades earlier. Why do they never face consequences? Kira's voice emerged as a whisper, the words slightly slurred but their meaning razor-sharp. Her unfocused eyes turned toward where he sat. The safety protocols, the oversight systems, they're designed to protect everyone, but they only ever fail us. He recognized the pattern in her questioning, the same analytical tendency that had made him valuable to intelligence operations years before. Where others saw orderly systems functioning as intended, she perceived the hidden fractures. Where security appeared absolute, she identified potential failure points others missed. Her mind naturally gravitated toward weaknesses, toward the subtle imperfections that could unravel entire networks. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to match her hushed tone. Navigation beacons drift approximately 0.02 degrees per standard cycle, he explained. Maintenance crews document the variance but rarely correct it until it exceeds tolerance thresholds. He described how cumulative errors compounded over time, how systems designed for perfection inevitably developed flaws through neglect and complacency. He spoke of thermal expansion affecting sensor calibration, of data logs that prioritized efficiency over accuracy, of the 1,000 tiny failures that eventually created catastrophic vulnerabilities. Through her pain-hazed focus, Kira's eyes sharpened. She visualized the racing routes through Sector 9, the precise paths Draven favored during his speed runs. Her analytical mind connected the mechanic's explanation of systemic drift to the specific beacons along that route, particularly the 17th marker that had shown anomalous readings in recent maintenance reports. The pieces aligned with painful clarity, not as random occurrences, but as interconnected elements in a pattern she could now perceive. Without realizing it, she had become his unwitting apprentice, her natural aptitude for spotting systemic weaknesses making her the ideal instrument for his plan. Her questions shifted from philosophical wondering to practical inquiry, her mind already working through the implications of what he'd revealed. The teacher had found his student in the most unlikely circumstances, the spy rediscovering his purpose through the awakening of another's analytical gifts. The navigation charts glowed on the mechanic's personal terminal, their light casting blue patterns across his lined face. His calloused finger traced the precise arc of Draven's favorite racing route through Sector 9, the path marked by 17 beacons that formed a perfect celestial highway. Vorak engineering teams proudly maintained this route as a demonstration of their technical superiority, a testament to their empire's insistence on flawless systems. Every beacon aligned within microscopic tolerances, every navigation marker calibrated to guide vessels with absolute precision. But the mechanic knew better than anyone that true perfection remained an illusion, especially in systems maintained by complacent overlords. His experienced eye scanned through 17 cycles of maintenance logs, each entry documenting the gradual drift of Beacon 17. The variance had started small, barely half a degree, but accumulated over time through neglected adjustments. For 17 standard cycles, maintenance crews had logged the deviation without correcting it, their reports buried in automated systems that prioritized visible efficiency over actual precision. 3 degrees might seem insignificant to anyone who hadn't studied high-velocity navigation dynamics. At standard shipping speeds, navigation computers compensated for such deviations with minimal energy expenditure, adjusting course in barely perceptible increments. The error meant nothing for cargo haulers or passenger transports moving at regulated velocities. But Draven pushed his custom racer to 98% capacity on these runs, treating safety margins as suggestions rather than limits. At maximum velocity, the 3-degree miscalibration created a cascading failure scenario. The racer's navigation system would detect the deviation milliseconds after passing Beacon 17, already committed to a trajectory that would grow increasingly unstable. Shield generators would attempt to compensate for the unplanned course adjustment, drawing power from structural integrity fields in the process. The conflicting gravitational forces from subsequent beacons would pull at the hull from multiple vectors, creating stress fractures at the microscopic level. Within seconds, the compounding forces would overwhelm the ship's capacity to compensate. The shield generators would overload, dumping catastrophic energy back into the primary systems. The hull would begin buckling under strain patterns it was never designed to withstand. The beautiful machine would tear itself apart from the inside, a victim of physics rather than external attack. No explosives needed planting, no weapons required firing. The perfect accident already existed within the system's neglected imperfections, waiting only for someone to understand how to activate it. The weapon required no fabrication, merely recognition and a subtle nudge at the precise moment. The mechanic's plan leveraged Draven's own arrogance against him, using the Vorak Heir's reckless speed as the catalyst for his destruction. Physics would execute the sentence he'd passed, with gravity serving as both judge and executioner. The third shift brought a different quality of silence to HFY 7, the station's artificial daylight dimming to low-power amber, while the Vorak reduced their patrols to skeleton crews. Human workers became spectral figures during these hours, their movements ignored by overlords who considered night operations beneath their attention. The mechanic carried a standard sensor calibration kit, his shoulders slumped in the weary posture of someone working mandatory overtime. His boots scuffed against the metal deck plates with just the right amount of audible fatigue. Each step calculated to reinforce the illusion of harmless drudgery. He paused at the maintenance shaft entrance, his hand resting on the sealed hatch as if considering the work ahead. The motion sensors inside were calibrated to Vorak biological signatures, their sensitivity tuned to ignore the subtle thermal and electrical patterns of human physiology. This design flaw reflected the Empire's arrogance. They assumed their technology could distinguish significant threats from insignificant workers. The primary sensor emitted a soft ping as he approached, its red indicator blinking in preparation to alert security. From his toolkit, he selected a magnetic shunt device, its surface worn smooth from years of legitimate use. He pressed it against the sensor housing, the magnets aligning with specific access points along the unit's casing. The device emitted a low-frequency pulse that mimicked the system's own diagnostic cycle, tricking the sensor into believing it was undergoing routine maintenance. The red light shifted to a steady amber, then went dark entirely as the system suspended normal operation for 45 seconds. Further along the shaft, the secondary thermal sensor presented a different challenge. This unit detected body heat patterns inconsistent with mechanical systems, its algorithms designed to identify living intruders. The mechanic applied a precise stream of cryogenic coolant along the sensor's housing, the liquid vaporizing instantly as it contacted the warm metal. The temperature drop created a temporary blind spot exactly large enough for human passage, the sensor interpreting the sudden cold as a localized environmental anomaly rather than intentional interference. He moved through the narrow confines with economical motions, his body remembering techniques buried for decades. Each step placed weight carefully along structural supports to minimize vibrations, each breath controlled to prevent vapor clouds in the chilled air. His hands trailed along the walls without actually touching them, maintaining balance through subtle weight shifts. The muscle memory returned not as conscious thought but as physical instinct, his body recalling evasion patterns his mind had tried to forget. 23 years of covert operations resurfaced in the way he paused at each intersection. How he listened for the specific frequency of Vorak communications, how he timed his movements to coincide with routine system checks. The skills had lain dormant but intact, waiting for the precise circumstances that would reactivate them. His heartbeat remained steady, his breathing pattern unchanged despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This was the dance he knew better than any other, performed in darkness for an audience that would never know they were being deceived. The 17th beacon's access panel glowed with soft blue light at the end of the shaft, its Vorak security seals intact and undisturbed. He reached it without triggering a single alert, the surveillance systems recording nothing but empty corridors and normal maintenance cycles. The real work would begin here, where electronic eyes ceased watching and the station's infrastructure opened to those who understood its secrets. His tools would no longer pretend to repair, they would now repurpose. The beacon's control panel emitted a soft cobalt glow, its surface alive with shimmering Vorak script that shifted and reconfigured in response to nearby movement. The interface employed psychological deterrence rather than physical barriers, its constantly changing symbols designed to overwhelm unauthorized users with visual confusion. The mechanic ignored the hypnotic dance of characters, his fingers moving to specific access points he'd identified decades earlier during covert infrastructure assessments. The panel's security features assumed intruders would be unfamiliar with Vorak systems, but he read the flowing script as easily as his native language. He connected a data slate to the maintenance port, its surface scarred from years of legitimate use in the mechanic bay. The device contained corrupted maintenance records harvested from 17 decommissioned automated maintenance units, their digital signatures altered to match current system protocols. Each record had been carefully modified to maintain internal consistency, while containing subtle chronological impossibilities that would escape casual inspection. The data represented ghosts of machinery that no longer existed, their electronic footprints lingering in backup systems long after their physical forms had been recycled. The Paxilon AI monitored every system modification with relentless precision, its algorithms designed to flag any anomaly for immediate investigation. The artificial intelligence processed thousands of data streams simultaneously, comparing current activities against established patterns dating back decades. Its vigilance remained absolute, but its understanding relied on predictable parameters. It knew what constituted normal operation and what represented threat signatures. The mechanic's actions fell into a gray area the AI's programmers had never considered. Authorized-looking activity performed through unauthorized means using legitimate credentials that shouldn't exist. He uploaded records showing Automated Maintenance Unit 47 had performed routine calibration checks just 36 hours earlier. The documentation included energy signatures, tool usage metrics, and completion certificates that matched standard Vorak formatting. Unit 47 had been scrapped 5 years earlier after a catastrophic failure during reactor maintenance, its components distributed across 3 different recycling facilities. Yet its digital ghost persisted in the system logs, a remnant of incomplete data purging that created exploitable gaps in the AI's understanding of operational reality. The Paxilon AI processed the uploaded records, cross-referencing them against known decommission schedules and current assignment rosters. The discrepancies should have triggered immediate security alerts, but the mechanic had embedded the data within a cascade of other minor system errors and temporary glitches. The AI's priority protocols categorized the anomaly as background noise rather than active threat, another symptom of the station's aging infrastructure. It logged the irregularity for future analysis by organic technicians who might review the logs in 6 standard cycles, if ever. He initiated the 3-degree adjustment using command sequences that mirrored automated system corrections. The calibration shift occurred gradually over 90 seconds, its progress masked by simulated diagnostic routines that created plausible electronic cover. The change registered in the logs as a spontaneous recalibration event, rather than manual intervention, consistent with documented instances of beacon drift under specific thermal conditions. The system accepted the modification as another unexplained anomaly in a network that experienced hundreds of minor irregularities each cycle. The sabotage became merely another undocumented glitch in a system overflowing with them, its significance hidden among countless other maintenance anomalies. The stage now stood prepared with everything in position for the performance to commence. All that remained was for the principal actor to take his place upon it, following the script written through careful observation of his habits and arrogance. The machinery of consequence had been set in motion through subtle manipulations that left no visible traces, only the inevitable results of physics interacting with carefully engineered circumstances. Draven's Xerion racer launched from its docking clamps precisely at 2300 hours, its triple-engine ignition sequence roaring through the station's lower decks. The chrome hull reflected the distant starlight as it cleared the exit bay, azure energy shields flaring to life with their characteristic 3-frequency harmonic whine. The sound modulated through distinct pitch changes as the engines reached optimal temperature, a signature the mechanic recognized immediately through his hidden receiver. He stood in the shadows of his maintenance bay, one hand resting on a hydraulic lift while the other adjusted the frequency scanner concealed behind his workbench. Traffic control channels filled his ear with routine communications, controllers clearing sectors for the Vorak Heir's nocturnal ritual. Draven pushed the racer beyond recommended limits immediately, the ship's velocity climbing toward maximum capacity within seconds of leaving the station. The azure shields brightened against the blackness of space, their shimmering patterns resembling electrical storms contained within precise geometric boundaries. He took the first navigation beacon at perfect alignment, the ship's trajectory cutting through the marker's center with mathematical precision. The second beacon followed in identical fashion, then the third and fourth, each pass reinforcing Drax's confidence in his machine and his skill. By the 12th marker, the racer had become a blur of motion and light, moving at velocities that transformed minor course deviations into potential catastrophes. The ship's systems worked continuously to maintain stability, compensating for gravitational variances and spatial distortions that would have torn lesser vessels apart. Draven ignored all safety protocols, treating recommended limits as mere suggestions beneath his superior abilities. The 17th beacon approached with its subtle 3-degree miscalibration, its error invisible to sensors designed to detect only significant deviations. At standard shipping speeds, the variance meant nothing. At moderate velocities, it required minimal correction. But at Draven's current velocity of 312 meters per second, the slight misalignment created compounding forces that exceeded the racer's capacity to compensate. The navigation system detected the anomaly milliseconds too late, already committed to a trajectory that would now diverge dangerously from the intended path. The racer struck the miscalibrated point at precisely the wrong vector and speed, its shields flaring violently as they attempted to correct course. Energy meant for structural integrity flooded into navigation systems, overloading circuits not designed for such emergency rerouting. The conflicting gravitational forces from subsequent beacons pulled at the hull from multiple angles, creating stress patterns that spread through the frame like fractures in glass. For 3 terrifying seconds, the beautiful machine tried to reconcile impossible physics with engineering limitations. The shield generators failed first, dumping catastrophic energy back into primary systems. The hull began buckling under strain it was never designed to withstand, microfractures becoming visible along the chrome surface. The primary engines continued pushing forward while navigation systems screamed for course correction, the conflicting commands tearing the vessel apart from within. The explosion illuminated Sector 9 with silent brilliance, debris scattering through shipping lanes in an expanding cloud of metal and energy. Physics had taken over where planning ended, executing consequences with absolute impartiality. The 3-degree misalignment meant nothing until the navigation system engaged its emergency protocols. The racer's computers detected the trajectory deviation milliseconds after passing Beacon 17, processing the error with algorithmic precision that couldn't overcome the laws of physics. The systems had already committed to the existing course vector, their calculations based on predetermined assumptions about the beacon's alignment. The slight deviation became magnified exponentially at Draven's velocity, transforming a minor navigation error into a catastrophic cascade of conflicting commands. Shield generators surged to compensate for the unplanned course correction, drawing massive power from structural integrity systems. Energy meant for hull reinforcement flooded into navigation circuits, overloading systems not designed for such emergency rerouting. The Azure shields flared violently, their patterns shifting from geometric precision to chaotic energy discharges. The power drain created instant vulnerabilities at multiple stress points along the frame, microscopic fractures spreading through the chrome hull like invisible webs. The primary engines continued pushing forward at maximum thrust, while navigation systems screamed for immediate course correction. The conflicting commands tore at the ship's fundamental architecture, creating opposing forces that no single vessel could withstand. Stress fractures became visible along the hull's surface, thin lines of brilliant white light appearing where the structure began failing. The beautiful machine started coming apart from within, its perfection undone by a tiny imperfection deliberately introduced into its guidance system. The explosion illuminated Sector 9 with silent intensity, a brief star blooming in the darkness before collapsing into expanding debris. Metal fragments scattered through shipping lanes, their trajectories mapped by traffic control sensors automatically rerouting vessels around the disaster zone. The racer's engine core ruptured moments after the initial structural failure, releasing contained plasma in a secondary explosion that vaporized what remained of the chrome hull. Draven died without comprehending what had happened, his consciousness extinguished between one system alert and the next. His death occurred not in glorious combat, but through the silent application of physics and neglected maintenance. The investigation teams launched from the station before the debris field had stabilized, their ship's scanners already collecting data from the scattering fragments. Traffic control logs recorded the exact sequence of system failures, the digital testimony of a perfect accident waiting for investigators to interpret. The official inquiry would begin with these cold facts, the mechanical autopsy of a tragedy that appeared inevitable rather than engineered. Vorak security vessels established a perimeter around the debris field, their search patterns systematic and thorough. They collected every fragment large enough to analyze, their sensors mapping the distribution of wreckage with clinical precision. The investigation would follow standard protocols for catastrophic accidents, examining maintenance records, system logs, and witness statements. The mechanic monitored their progress from his bay, listening to the official frequencies as they began their work. The evidence pointed toward mechanical failure compounded by excessive speed, exactly as he had designed it to appear. Lord Raneth Vorak's arrival in the mechanic bay shattered the usual rhythm of third shift. His personal guard filled the cramped space, their armored forms blocking the exits as their lord stood at the center, his scaled hands clenched at his sides. The air grew thick with the scent of aggression pheromones, a bitter scent the Vorak emitted when experiencing heightened emotional states. The mechanic stood near his workbench, his hands clasped behind his back in the precise submissive posture the Vorak expected from human workers. His head remained slightly bowed, his eyes fixed on the oil-stained floor plating just ahead of Lord Raneth's polished boots. "Explain this failure," Lord Raneth demanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the bay's metal surfaces. His primary eyes remained fixed on the mechanic while his secondary eyes scanned the tools and equipment, searching for anything out of place. The grief behind his words transformed into imperial fury, a mask of controlled rage that barely concealed his loss. "My heir does not die from accidents. The investigation will find what truly occurred here." The mechanic kept his voice calm and measured, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant technical news. "Navigation beacons experience gradual drift over time, my lord. The maintenance logs for Sector 9 show calibration issues dating back 17 cycles." He described the cumulative effect of minor adjustments being deferred, the way small errors could compound into significant deviations. His explanation remained strictly technical, devoid of emotion or accusation, the dry recitation of facts that any senior mechanic might provide. "Automated Maintenance Unit 47 performed the last calibration check," he continued, his eyes still lowered. "Its records show standard procedures were followed, but Unit 47 was decommissioned 5 years ago after a reactor incident. The system still accepts its digital signature for routine maintenance tasks." He let the implication hang in the air between them, the ghost in the machine that the Vorak's own complacency had created. The Paxilon AI's blind spots became visible through his careful explanation, the systemic failures that made such tragedies possible. "Sometimes, my lord," he said quietly, "even the most skilled make mistakes." The words hung in the air between them, a carefully crafted statement that carried multiple layers of meaning. He maintained his neutral expression, his body language suggesting respectful sympathy rather than hidden knowledge. Lord Raneth's primary eyes narrowed slightly, a barely perceptible shift that indicated something beyond his understanding had been glimpsed. He recognized the technical truth in the mechanic's words, but couldn't articulate the deeper reality, that his empire's culture of cruelty had finally produced an answer it couldn't punish. The official investigation concluded with the expected findings: equipment failure compounded by excessive speed. The report protected Vorak pride by attributing the tragedy to technical issues, rather than admitting any systemic vulnerability or human intervention. The mechanic returned to his work, his performance accepted as truth by those who needed to believe in their own invulnerability. The official story served its purpose, burying the reality beneath layers of plausible documentation and comfortable conclusions. The medical field dissolved from Kira's forearm, leaving pale skin marked with faint traceries where bone had been restructured. Her fingers flexed slowly, testing the repaired joints with careful movements. But her mind retained the patterns formed during weeks of immobilization, thoughts now organized around vulnerabilities in systems rather than simple survival. She watched the mechanic cleaning tools at his workbench, his movements economical and precise, each motion serving multiple purposes. "Who were you before this station?" she asked, her voice still carrying the careful tone of someone testing newly acquired freedom. "What life did you leave behind to become a mechanic on HFY 7? Her eyes followed the way his hands moved, recognizing patterns she hadn't noticed before. The questions hung between them, seeking answers about the past while really asking about the future. He wiped grease from a hydrospanner, his attention remaining on the tool rather than her face. "Specific identities matter less than methodologies," he said, his voice neutral. "What matters is understanding how power functions through weakness rather than strength." He set the tool aside and turned toward her, his expression revealing nothing of his personal history, but everything about his operational philosophy. "The strongest doors have the weakest hinges. The most secure systems contain the most exploitable flaws." He began teaching her to see the station not as a fixed structure but as a collection of interconnected systems, each with control points and failure vulnerabilities. They walked through maintenance corridors while he explained how environmental controls could be manipulated through sensor key PN. how communication networks could be disrupted through targeted interference. He showed her how to identify which systems received minimal oversight, which procedures were followed through habit rather than necessity, which security features existed only for appearance. True power lies in understanding dependencies, he explained as they studied a power distribution schematic. The Vorak believe their strength comes from overwhelming force, but it actually depends on predictable patterns and unquestioned assumptions. He demonstrated how a 3-degree adjustment in a navigation beacon could destroy a ship, how a falsified maintenance log could hide sabotage, how a decommissioned unit's digital signature could still access secure systems. Kira's analytical mind absorbed the lessons with rapid comprehension. Where she had once seen impenetrable Vorak authority, she now recognized potential failure points. Her thought processes shifted from passive observation to active analysis, her mind constantly identifying weaknesses in systems others considered secure. She began seeing patterns in everything from shift rotations to supply deliveries, her natural aptitude for spotting irregularities becoming sharpened through his guidance. They practiced during third shift hours, working in deserted maintenance bays and empty corridors. He taught her how to falsify logs so the alterations appeared to have always existed, how to bypass motion sensors using thermal manipulation and magnetic interference. Together, they created digital ghosts of maintenance drones that never existed, their fabricated records accepted by systems designed to detect deception. Her hands grew steady with tools designed for infiltration rather than repair, her movements becoming as silent and purposeful as his. She transformed from survivor to practitioner, her mind and skills now oriented toward the silent arts he embodied. The lessons shifted from theoretical concepts to practical applications, her questions becoming more sophisticated as her understanding deepened. The apprentice developed readiness for conflicts beyond personal survival. Her education, preparing her for battles where victory would be measured in systemic changes rather than individual triumphs. The merchant vessel docking at HFY 7's lower bay carried standard cargo containers and a single human passenger who moved with the weary grace of someone accustomed to long journeys. Her clothing matched the practical workwear of station laborers, durable synthetic fabric in muted grays, boots scuffed from metal decks, gloves tucked into a worn utility belt. But her eyes held a different quality, scanning the bay with methodical precision that missed no detail. From the maintenance schedules posted near airlocks to the security camera placements along the ceiling tracks, she found the mechanic during third shift, when the bay sat empty except for the low hum of inactive machinery and the occasional drip of condensation from overhead pipes. He was recalibrating a thruster array when she approached, her footsteps deliberately audible on the metal grating. She stopped at a respectful distance, her hands visible at her sides in the universal gesture of non-threatening approach. "They said I'd find you working late," she stated, her voice carrying the flat accent of the core colonies. The man who used to extract Vorak battle plans from their secure networks now services their pleasure craft. Her knowledge hung between them, specific and unnerving. She knew his real name, the operations he'd run before disappearance, the exact date he'd vanished from Colonial Intelligence Service roles. "The service is reforming," she continued, her eyes tracking the movement of his hands as he continued working. Unofficially, of course, but urgently. She described their need for people who understood how to operate in hostile territory without support, who could function independently for extended periods. Her words painted a picture of a galaxy where official protections had failed, where covert action had become necessary again despite political denials. The Colonial Intelligence Service needed its old operatives back, along with whatever new talents they might have cultivated during their absence. Her gaze shifted to the shadowed doorway where Kira stood watching, having approached without making a sound. The young woman's analytical eyes were already assessing the stranger, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the way her weight distributed evenly between both feet, the slight bulge of a concealed weapon beneath her jacket. "Bring your apprentice," the woman said, her attention returning to the mechanic. "We can always use people who learn quickly." The offer hung in the air between them, transforming their situation from hidden survival to potential purpose. The mechanic set down his tools, the clang of metal against metal echoing in the empty bay. The decision crystallized not as a choice between safety and danger, but between continued hiding and active resistance. They could remain on HFY 7, repairing Vorak ships while pretending not to notice the oppression around them, or they could apply their skills towards something larger than personal survival. The woman waited silently, her presence representing a door opening to a path he'd thought closed forever. Survival had become insufficient measured against the possibility of purpose. Their quiet corner of the galaxy suddenly connected to larger struggles waiting for their particular talents. The refitted cargo runner slipped from HFY 7's docking clamps with minimal energy signature, its scarred hull absorbing station lights rather than reflecting them. The mechanic guided the vessel through standard departure protocols, his hands moving across controls with familiar precision, while Kira monitored the newly upgraded sensor arrays. Her fingers traced potential routes through the next sector's beacon network, identifying patterns in the navigation markers that most pilots would consider routine infrastructure. The ship's systems hummed with enhancements concealed beneath their worn exterior, a mobile operational base prepared for extended independent operations. Lord Renith Vorak would never acknowledge the truth unfolding across his empire's territories. His cultural mythology required belief in Vorak invincibility, in the natural right of strength to dominate weakness. The reality of his heir's death as anything other than tragic accident remained impossible to accept, the cultural narrative more valuable than factual accuracy. This blindness created operational space for those willing to exploit the gap between perceived power and actual vulnerability. The Empire's cruelty contained the seeds of its own limitation, its reliance on fear creating predictable patterns of behavior. Each new station became both workshop and classroom, their methods refining with practice. They identified maintenance supervisors who cut corners, security directors who falsified inspection reports, supply officers who diverted resources. The mechanic taught Kira how to amplify existing negligence into consequential failures, how to make accidents appear inevitable rather than engineered. They practiced altering environmental control settings to create temporary blind spots, adjusting communication relay timings to disrupt coordination, introducing minor errors into navigation databases that would compound over time. Their interventions remained small enough to escape, noticed but significant enough to create systemic friction. Kira's analytical mind identified three primary targets within the new sector's control infrastructure. The first involved a power distribution node serving Vorak administrative centers, its overload protections deliberately weakened to reduce operational costs. The second centered on a transportation hub, where inspection protocols had been relaxed for favored contractors. The third exploited a communication network vulnerability that allowed unauthorized access to military command channels. Her assessment considered not just immediate impact but secondary consequences, how each intervention might create additional opportunities down the line. "What now?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on the sector schematic glowing before her. The question carried the weight of their changed circumstances, from reactive survival to proactive engagement. The mechanic adjusted their course toward the first target coordinates, his attention divided between navigation and her question. "Now we find other things that need fixing," he answered, his voice calm amid the cockpit's soft electronic hum. The statement defined their new operational philosophy, transforming random opportunities into deliberate strategy. They would identify vulnerabilities the Vorak had created through their own arrogance and neglect, then apply precise corrections that appeared to be natural consequences. They adopted a credo that balanced ambition with patience. The meek would inherit the stars through accumulated small actions rather than dramatic victories. Each intervention would appear insignificant on its own, another minor failure in a system experiencing countless irregularities. But together they would form a pattern of systemic erosion, gradually undermining the foundations of Vorak control. Their approach leveraged time as their greatest ally, allowing the Empire's own weaknesses to work against it through careful amplification. Two humans became silent forces operating within the machine of Vorak domination, their individual actions connecting into a larger strategy of systemic change. Their refitted ship carried them between sectors, a mobile classroom and operational base that left no lasting trace of its passage. They worked without recognition or celebration, their victories measured in gradual shifts rather than decisive battles, their influence growing through patient application of understanding against strength. The Vorak motto echoed through the station's empty corridors like a mechanical heartbeat, its chilling simplicity repeated in training modules and official communications. The strong consume the weak, and the universe continues. This philosophy formed the foundation of their imperial expansion, justifying brutality as natural law and domination as cosmic inevitability. Their entire culture revolved around this belief, creating a society where power flowed from the ability to intimidate and control through overwhelming force. The axiom served as both explanation and excuse for their actions, a self-fulfilling prophecy that reinforced their position through fear rather than consent. But the mechanic understood the fundamental weakness hidden within this philosophy. Power based primarily on fear creates brittle systems that fracture under patient, intelligent opposition. He recognized that the Vorac's reliance on brute strength made them complacent, their systems predictable because they never expected anyone to challenge them through means other than direct confrontation. Their arrogance became their greatest vulnerability, their belief in their own invulnerability, blinding them to subtle threats operating outside their understanding of power dynamics. He taught Kira that true disruption comes not from matching force with force, but from identifying and exploiting the blind spots that powerful systems inevitably develop. The Vorak built impressive infrastructure and sophisticated control mechanisms, but each system contained weaknesses created by their own assumptions and priorities. The Paxilon AI's rigidity contrasted sharply with human ingenuity, its patterns becoming predictable and exploitable precisely because it operated within strict parameters. Where the AI saw only data points and compliance metrics, humans could perceive opportunities and connections. They accumulated small, nearly invisible changes across multiple systems, each adjustment seeming insignificant on its own, but collectively tilting the balance of power. A slight modification to environmental controls created temporary sensor blind spots exactly when needed. Minor adjustments to communication protocols introduced delays that disrupted Vorak coordination. Tiny errors planted in navigation databases would compound over time, creating eventual crises that appeared to be system failures rather than deliberate actions. Every shadowed corridor became a potential turning point. Every minor maintenance oversight a potential weapon waiting for the right moment. The mechanic demonstrated how centuries of brute force could be undermined through silence and precision. The Vorak expected grand rebellions and dramatic confrontations, their security forces prepared for open warfare and direct challenges. They remained blind to the gradual erosion happening within their own systems, the slow accumulation of adjustments that would eventually compromise their control. Their power structures, which appeared monolithic and enduring, actually depended on countless small components functioning perfectly, and each component offered potential vulnerability. They proved that galactic power structures were not as permanent as they pretended when confronted with patient, precise opposition. The Vorak Empire had stood for generations, its dominance seemingly unchallengeable through conventional means. But their reliance on fear and force created systems that could be dismantled from within by those who understood how they actually functioned. The universe would continue, but not necessarily according to Vorak designs, their supposed natural order disrupted by those they considered too weak to matter. The station doctor pressed a sealed medical kit into the mechanic's hands before their departure, her eyes avoiding direct contact as she delivered the warning. "They do not forgive and they never forget," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the docking bay's ventilation hum. The words hung between them like a verdict, reinforcing what he already understood about Vorak culture. Their safety would always remain conditional, their victories incomplete while the Empire maintained its dominance across the sector. Every successful intervention created temporary relief rather than permanent security, each action potentially drawing closer attention from forces that considered vengeance a cultural imperative. He accepted the medical supplies with a silent nod, his expression neutral as he processed the doctor's warning. Every new system they entered would bring fresh risks, unfamiliar surveillance networks, and different security protocols to navigate. Each port of call offered new chances of discovery, new opportunities for brutal retaliation against those who dared challenge Vorak authority. The mechanic understood they operated within a galaxy, deliberately designed to grind down the vulnerable, where systems of power protected themselves through overwhelming force and relentless persistence. Their existence had become a continuous calculation of risk versus impact, each decision weighing potential consequences against necessary actions. He recognized that their work might never reach a definitive conclusion, that each correction they implemented could create unforeseen problems elsewhere. Fixing one vulnerability might reveal another. Eliminating one abusive officer might create space for a more cunning replacement. The nature of systemic resistance meant engaging in an endless series of adjustments rather than achieving final victories. Their efforts resembled maintaining a complex machine that constantly developed new faults even as old ones were repaired. The process demanded continuous vigilance and adaptation, with no promise of eventual completion or safety. Yet when he looked at Kira, her posture straightening as she ran final checks on their ship's systems, he found the costs acceptable. The faint scars on her forearm served as permanent reminders of why they continued, while her sharpening analytical mind demonstrated what they could achieve. Her transformation from victim to operative justified the endless risks, her growing competence making the psychological burdens necessary rather than merely endurable. She represented both the reason for their actions and the validation of their methods, her development proving that their approach could create meaningful change even within hostile systems. They accepted that certain problems required permanent corrections rather than temporary solutions. The Vorak Empire's foundational philosophy of domination through strength needed fundamental challenging, not superficial adjustment. Their work would continue targeting the underlying mechanisms that enabled oppression, altering systems rather than merely treating symptoms. This understanding shifted their objectives from personal survival to structural change, their operations becoming part of a larger strategy rather than isolated acts of resistance. The war continued as they left the station behind, but now it proceeded on their terms rather than reacting to Vorak initiatives. They would choose their targets based on strategic value rather than personal grievance, their actions serving long-term goals instead of immediate needs. Their refitted ship became both weapon and classroom, carrying them toward confrontations they would initiate rather than endure. The conflict had transformed from something they suffered into something they directed, their understanding of power dynamics allowing them to operate within the system's weaknesses rather than confronting its strengths directly. Kira studied the schematics of the Vorak supply depot, her finger tracing the environmental control conduits that snaked through the lower levels. She identified a vulnerability where oxygen sensors connected to the central monitoring system, their calibration settings accessible through a maintenance port near the primary ventilation shafts. The system's design prioritized energy efficiency over security, assuming no one would target such mundane components. Her analysis revealed that triggering false oxygen-level alarms would force a full depot evacuation during a high-priority weapons shipment scheduled for that evening. The mechanic observed from their ship's command console, his attention divided between system scans and the live feed from Kira's concealed body cam. He watched her approach the access point, her movements measured and deliberate despite the tension visible in her shoulders. His guidance remained silent now, the comm channel open but unused, allowing her to work through the challenges without interference.
This moment represented the culmination of months of training.
The transition from theory to practical application under real operational conditions. Her hands trembled slightly as she bypassed the first security sensor, the magnetic shunt device clicking into place with barely audible precision. The tremor vanished as concentration took over, her fingers moving with increasing confidence through the sequence he'd taught her. She accessed the calibration settings through a maintenance override, her movements mirroring his techniques with exact replication. The oxygen sensor parameters appeared on her data slate, their current values reflecting standard Vorak environmental protocols. She created digital ghosts of maintenance drones that never existed, uploading fabricated service records showing routine calibration checks had been performed earlier that cycle. The system accepted the false documentation without question. Its security protocols focused on external threats rather than internal manipulations. Her adjustments to the oxygen sensors were minimal, just enough to trigger alarms at specific pressure thresholds during the shipment's loading procedures. The changes appeared in the logs as automated system corrections, their timing coinciding with recorded maintenance cycles. The alarms activated precisely as the Vorak transport began unloading its sensitive cargo. Klaxons echoed through the depot as emergency protocols initiated automatic lockdown procedures. Ventilation systems sealed, security doors engaged, and evacuation orders flashed across every display. The Vorak troops abandoned their positions, their training prioritizing immediate response to environmental threats over cargo security. The shipment sat unattended for 6 critical hours while safety teams conducted thorough atmospheric checks, their investigations ultimately finding nothing but system glitches. Kira returned to the ship through secondary maintenance tunnels, her movements calm and controlled, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. She removed her work gear with practiced efficiency, stowing each tool in its designated compartment. When she finally met the mechanic's gaze, her eyes held a quiet triumph that went beyond mere success. The operation had confirmed her understanding of how systems could be manipulated, how small adjustments could create significant disruptions without direct confrontation. The student had become a practitioner, her analytical mind now coupled with operational experience. The survivor had transformed into a warrior, her capabilities extending beyond personal defense to strategic action. Their ship departed the sector as depot operations slowly returned to normal, the Vorak none the wiser about the deliberate nature of the disruption. The incident would be recorded as another unexplained system anomaly, its true significance known only to those who understood how to read between the lines of official reports. The operative returned 7 cycles later, arriving on a supply freighter that smelled of ozone and hydroponic nutrients. She found them in a disused cargo bay on Tamsin Station, her movements precise as she navigated the maze of containers without consulting any maps. Her clothing still bore the stains of her cover identity as a cargo dispatcher, but her eyes retained that unsettling awareness that missed nothing. She handed the mechanic a data chip containing coordinates for 3 separate human cells operating in adjacent sectors, her fingers brushing his palm with deliberate contact that conveyed more than coordinates alone. They met the communications specialist in a sound-dampened storage container, the air thick with the scent of old lubricants and recycled oxygen. The man moved with the nervous energy of someone living under constant surveillance, his fingers constantly tracing patterns on his leg as he spoke. His cover as a cargo dispatcher provided perfect access to shipping manifests and communication networks, allowing him to move information through channels the Vorak considered beneath their notice. He showed them how maintenance requests could carry coded messages in their technical specifications, how data packets could be corrupted in ways that concealed hidden information. They discovered dozens of humans operating throughout Vorak-controlled space, each using their specialized skills to undermine the Empire's control. Engineers introduced subtle flaws in construction projects. Data analysts manipulated inventory records to create shortages. Medical technicians altered biological samples to obscure human genetic markers. The network functioned without central leadership, its members connected through shared understanding rather than formal organization. They represented a distributed intelligence system the Vorak could neither comprehend nor contain, their actions appearing as random anomalies rather than coordinated resistance. Information traveled through coded maintenance requests that embedded messages in technical specifications. Corrupted data packets carried hidden information within seemingly damaged files. The system relied on the Vorak's own arrogance. Their belief that humans lacked the sophistication for such operations made them blind to the patterns developing within their infrastructure. The network's strength came from its decentralization, with no single point of failure that could be targeted for elimination. Kira's pattern recognition mind began connecting their disparate efforts into something greater than isolated actions. She mapped the relationships between a power technician's intentional voltage fluctuations in one sector and a transport coordinator's deliberate routing errors in another. Her analytical abilities revealed how small, seemingly unrelated actions could combine to create significant systemic stress. She saw the emerging pattern of resistance not as random acts of defiance, but as components of a larger strategy, waiting for coordination. They realized their individual actions contributed to a collective effort that extended far beyond their personal experiences. The mechanic's precise adjustments to navigation systems complemented a data analyst's manipulations of supply logs. Kira's environmental control interventions supported an engineer's structural weakening of Vorak facilities. Each operation reinforced the others, creating cumulative effects that neither could achieve alone. Their understanding shifted from isolated fixes to interconnected components of a larger whole. The transition from individual operations to coordinated strategy occurred without discussion or declaration. They simply began adjusting their actions to complement other cells' activities, their timing synchronized through the network's communication methods. What had been random acts of sabotage became calculated interventions designed to maximize collective impact. Their refitted ship became a mobile coordination point, its systems upgraded to handle the increased data flow from multiple sources. The isolated fixes of the past gave way to deliberate strategy, their individual skills merging into something more powerful than the sum of its parts. Kira analyzed the Vorak promotion records, her fingers tracing patterns of advancement through the dense data streams. She identified the precise mechanism that rewarded brutality, how mid-level commanders earned recognition through demonstrated cruelty toward human populations. The system incentivized violence as career advancement, creating officers who saw oppression as professional achievement rather than moral failure. Her analytical mind mapped the pathways that turned ordinary soldiers into vicious commanders, the institutional pressures that transformed compliance into cruelty. Changing this required surgical interventions in personnel systems rather than dramatic confrontations. They needed to manipulate performance reviews and assignment records with subtle precision, altering career trajectories through carefully placed adjustments. The mechanic accessed Vorak military databases through backdoors created by their network, his movements through the security protocols as silent as his earlier penetration of maintenance shafts. They identified 3 particularly brutal commanders whose careers showed patterns of accelerating violence matched by rapid promotions. They created accidents that discredited the worst offenders while advancing less aggressive alternatives. A commander known for destroying human settlements found his supply requests mysteriously delayed, leaving his troops under-provisioned during critical operations. His performance reviews suddenly documented logistical failures rather than tactical successes. Another officer specializing in interrogation techniques experienced communication breakdowns that isolated him from command support, his effectiveness diminishing as his brutality increased. The system interpreted these patterns as incompetence rather than resistance, naturally promoting calmer officers who achieved results through planning rather than force. Small adjustments to transportation schedules achieved significant isolation effects. They altered deployment timetables to separate problematic commanders from their established support networks, placing them in situations where their brutal methods proved counterproductive. Officers accustomed to unquestioned authority found themselves leading units unfamiliar with their tactics, their usual intimidation methods meeting resistance rather than compliance. The delays and disruptions appeared as routine logistical errors, their cumulative impact gradually reducing the effectiveness of violence as a leadership tool. Over 17 cycles, the Vorak military culture began shifting away from extreme brutality. Promotion boards started favoring commanders who maintained control through discipline rather than fear, their efficiency metrics showing better long-term results. The change occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the system naturally selected for different leadership qualities. Officers who might have risen through cruelty found their careers stalling, while those demonstrating strategic thinking advanced more rapidly. The institutional memory began retaining different lessons about what constituted effective command. They learned that changing systems required understanding their internal mechanics rather than simply opposing their outputs. The Vorak military functioned according to specific incentives and reward structures that could be manipulated through precise interventions. Their actions demonstrated that power based on fear remained brittle against patient, intelligent opposition that understood how the system actually operated. The philosophy of systemic change proved more effective than direct confrontation, leveraging the Empire's own structures against its worst excesses. Personal revenge evolved into structural reform as their objectives expanded beyond individual accountability. Their focus shifted from punishing specific officers to altering the conditions that created them. The mechanic's initial satisfaction with Draven's death transformed into broader purpose. His understanding of power dynamics applied to larger patterns. Their operations became less about settling scores and more about reshaping systems. Their interventions designed to create lasting change rather than temporary justice. The transition represented both strategic evolution and moral growth, their methods maturing along with their objectives. The mechanic woke with his hands gripping an imaginary weapon, the phantom weight of a plasma rifle still pressing against his shoulder. The dream lingered in the transition between sleep and wakefulness, a confrontation in a rain-slicked alley, the smell of ozone and blood, the cold calculation of choosing between two impossible outcomes. His fingers remembered the specific texture of that weapon's trigger, a memory buried for 23 years that resurfaced with unsettling clarity. His mind replayed protocols he'd forced himself to forget, emergency extraction codes and contingency plans that once dictated his every movement. Kira watched him from across the ship's small galley, her analytical eyes noting the slight tremble in his hands as he poured kaf. "What made you choose this life?" she asked, her voice quiet but direct. The question hung between them, more complex than it appeared. She wasn't asking about mechanics or even espionage, but about the path that led someone to disappear into obscurity after wielding significant power. He stirred his kaf slowly, the spoon clicking against the ceramic in a rhythm that matched the ship's environmental systems. "The Colonial Intelligence Service required certain calculations," he said, his eyes focused on the liquid's swirling surface. "Sometimes silencing predators meant becoming what you fought against." He described the cold arithmetic of weighing lives against outcomes, the moral compromises that accumulated like corrosion on a ship's hull, the operations that forced him to make choices where every option caused damage, where protecting some required sacrificing others. The memories served as both warning and compass, reminding him that their work demanded moral anchoring alongside technical skill. He'd seen how easily justification could slide into rationalization, how the machinery of resistance could consume those who operated it. The loss of his daughter to Vorak expansion remained the unspoken center of his story, the personal tragedy that transformed abstract principles into urgent necessity. Every intervention carried that weight, every calculated action informed by that specific pain. He taught her that fixing broken systems didn't require breaking themselves in the process. "We maintain our humanity through precision, not through becoming machines," he explained during their training sessions. He showed her how to channel anger into focus, how to transform desire for revenge into commitment to justice. Their actions needed to create more than just damage. They needed to build alternatives through the spaces they cleared. Their partnership became his redemption as much as her education. Guiding her allowed him to reconcile his past actions with present purpose, to ensure his hard-won skills served protection rather than destruction. She learned not just techniques but context, understanding why certain methods were reserved for extreme circumstances and others remained off-limits entirely. Her development represented a second chance, an opportunity to pass on knowledge without repeating past mistakes. The past informed their present actions without dictating them. His experience provided cautionary lessons rather than rigid protocols, his memories offering guidance rather than commandments. They moved forward with awareness of what could be lost, what might be compromised, but also what could be preserved through careful action. The work continued, but now with deeper understanding of its costs and necessities. Sector 9's racing culture transformed gradually over 17 cycles. Its once thrilling speedruns now approached with superstitious caution. Racers began avoiding the shipping corridors around the 17th beacon, their vessels slowing to carefully measured velocities that left ample margin for error. The Vorak engineering teams documented the behavioral shift in their reports, attributing it to irrational human tendencies rather than acknowledging any actual systemic vulnerability. The change reflected a fundamental loss of confidence in the safety of routes that had once symbolized Vorak technical superiority. Vorak operational efficiency declined as officers became slightly less brutal in their treatment of human workers. The promotion system's gradual shift toward rewarding strategic thinking over pure intimidation created commanders who preferred calculated operations to indiscriminate force. Supply shipments experienced more frequent delays, patrol schedules showed increased irregularities, and response times to incidents lengthened by measurable margins. The Empire's veneer of invincibility developed hairline fractures under the accumulated weight of countless small corrections, each insignificant alone but collectively transformative. Human workers noticed the subtle changes in Vorak behavior and responded with quiet adjustments of their own. They stood slightly straighter when Vorak officers passed through maintenance bays, their posture losing the automatic defensive slump of the oppressed. Their voices carried slightly louder during shift changes, conversations continuing rather than ceasing at Vorak approach. These minor acts of defiance reflected growing awareness that the power structure wasn't immutable, that resistance could produce tangible results through patience and precision. The mechanic and Kira became legendary figures within the resistance network, known simply as the ghosts who fixed what others couldn't. Their reputation spread through coded maintenance requests and corrupted data packets, their methods studied and adapted by other cells. They never sought recognition, operating with silent efficiency that transformed them into near mythological figures. Their actions demonstrated that significant change could emerge from seemingly insignificant interventions, that patient opposition could achieve what direct confrontation never could. Their philosophy spread through the network. Power based primarily on fear remains brittle against systematic, precise opposition. The Vorak Empire's reliance on intimidation created systems that could be undermined through understanding rather than matched through force. Their approach emphasized exploiting structural weaknesses rather than challenging surface strength, leveraging time and knowledge against raw power. This understanding transformed resistance from desperate rebellion into strategic engagement. They proved through accumulated actions that the universe continues not through strength-consuming weakness, but through balanced systems where power finds its limits. The Vorak axiom of natural domination gave way to observable reality. Systems that rely on fear eventually create their own opposition through accumulated resentment and clever exploitation. Their work demonstrated that lasting change comes from altering underlying mechanics, rather than simply opposing visible manifestations. The refitted cargo runner moved between sectors, its scarred hull absorbing starlight as it navigated beacon networks. Kira monitored navigation systems while the mechanic reviewed intelligence from their growing network. Their interventions continued targeting specific vulnerabilities, each adjustment carefully calibrated to produce maximum effect, with minimum visibility. The work extended beyond personal vengeance or even systemic reform into something approaching philosophical demonstration. Their actions created a legacy of quiet resistance that would outlast their specific involvement. The methods they developed and shared would continue affecting Vorak operations long after they moved to other sectors or other struggles. The approach they perfected, patient, precise, and persistent, would influence resistance efforts across multiple systems, proving that significant change could be achieved one careful adjustment at a time. The work never truly ended, merely shifted focus as new vulnerabilities were identified and new corrections implemented, each action contributing to a larger pattern of rebalancing. The galaxy's power structures are not as permanent as they appear when confronted with patient, precise opposition. The mechanic and Kira proved that silence and insight can unravel even the most entrenched systems of control. They became ghosts within the machine, their corrections so subtle they appeared as natural failures. The meek may yet inherit the stars, but only if they learn to claim them through understanding rather than force. Their legacy lives in every adjusted beacon, every shifted balance, every quiet act of reclamation that reminds the powerful their reign is never absolute.